There comes a delicate moment in a person's emotional life when something no longer makes sense, even though on the surface everything seems fine. Love exists. The relationship continues. Conversations still happen. But inside, something no longer settles. It feels like being in a place that once felt safe, but no longer provides warmth. Love is there, but it doesn't comfort. And quietly, emptiness begins to grow. This emptiness does not come from a sudden break. It doesn't arrive with shouting, accusations, or dramatic goodbyes. On the contrary, it settles in slowly, almost unnoticed. You begin to feel that something is missing, but you can't quite name it. You are with someone, yet you feel alone. You receive messages, but they no longer reach your heart. Affection exists, but it no longer touches where it should. What makes it even more confusing is that often there is no clear reason for this feeling. There was no major betrayal, no obvious traumatic event. Still, your chest feels heavier. Your mind feels more tired, and the inner silence becomes louder. At this point, many people ask themselves, "What is wrong with me?" When perhaps the right question is, "What is missing inside me within this relationship?" When love does not comfort, it stops being a place of emotional rest. It becomes a space of constant effort, where you need to adapt, explain yourself, and hold back. Little by little, you start reducing your words, your feelings, your expectations. Not because you want to, but because you notice that expressing too much creates distance, conflict, or indifference. And so, in order to preserve the relationship, you begin to shrink. This is how emptiness grows. Not necessarily because love has ended, but because you have been leaving parts of yourself behind. Love that does not welcome you demands that you become less in order to fit, and no human being remains whole when they must fragment themselves to be accepted. This kind of emptiness is especially dangerous because it coexists with the appearance of normality. To those looking from the outside, everything seems fine. But inside, there is a deep emotional exhaustion, a sense of disconnection, and a longing for yourself that hurts more than the absence of the other. Recognizing this emptiness is not weakness. It is awareness. It is the first sign that something needs to be seen more honestly. Because love, when healthy, may challenge you, but it should never empty you. It should be shelter, not a place where you lose yourself. If you saw yourself in these words, know that you are not alone in this experience. Many people live this emotional silence every day without being able to name it. And naming what you feel is the first step toward understanding what to do with it. One of the hardest signs to recognize in a relationship is when the other person's presence no longer brings relief. They are there, physically close, theoretically available, yet emotionally distant. You sit next to them, share the same space, sleep in the same bed, and still feel an invisible gap between you. It is not physical absence. It is the absence of connection. At first, you try to ignore this feeling. You tell yourself it is just a phase, that every relationship goes through quieter moments, that love does not need to be intense all the time. And that is true. But there is a profound difference between comfortable silence and silence that weighs on you. The first one calms. The second one consumes. When presence does not comfort, you begin to feel alone even when accompanied. There is no safe space to talk about what hurts. Not because the other person is cruel, but because they seem unavailable, distracted, or simply unable to truly listen. Conversations become superficial. Important topics are postponed, and later never comes. Little by little, you learn to stay quiet. Not because you lack feelings, but because you have too many. You realize that whenever you try to open up, something gets lost along the way. The response does not come, or it comes empty, or it comes filled with impatience. So, to avoid frustration, you hold everything in. You swallow your words. You remain silent. And that silence begins to pile up inside you, This is one of the most dangerous moments in any relationship. Because silence does not solve anything. It only postpones it. And everything that is left unsaid finds other ways to manifest. Constant fatigue, irritation without an apparent reason, the feeling of being emotionally overloaded. You begin to feel invisible within your own story. When love does not welcome you, it stops being a place where you can emotionally rest. It becomes a place where you must always be alert, constantly measuring your words, always choosing what can or cannot be said. This creates a continuous state of inner tension, and no one can feel whole while living on constant alert. What hurts the most is realizing that even when you try to explain yourself, you do not feel understood. It is like speaking a language the other person does not understand. You repeat yourself, rephrase, try again, and still, something essential does not reach the other side. This lack of emotional recognition slowly erodes the relationship from within, even when, on the outside, everything seems stable. Over time, emptiness stops being an occasional feeling and becomes a permanent state. You do not just miss the other person, you miss yourself. The version of you that spoke more freely, laughed more lightly, and felt seen. And this silent longing is a clear sign that something needs to be looked at honestly. Understanding that presence without emotional welcome also hurts is an important step, because love is not just about being together. It is about making the other feel safe, heard, and emotionally supported. When that does not happen, the body stays, but the heart slowly begins to drift away. Emotional emptiness rarely appears abruptly. It does not arise overnight, nor does it come accompanied by major events that justify its presence. On the contrary, it slowly seeps in, almost imperceptibly, occupying spaces that were once filled with enthusiasm, curiosity, and the desire to be together. By the time you notice, the emptiness is already there, woven into your routine. At first, this feeling shows up as mild discomfort, a strange sensation when waking up, even next to someone. A deeper sigh without knowing exactly why, a fatigue that does not go away, even after rest. You continue with life as usual, but something inside you always feels slightly out of place, as if you do not fully belong. This kind of emptiness is quiet. It does not demand immediate attention. It does not shout. It does not trigger obvious crises. Precisely because of that, it is easy to ignore. You convince yourself that it is just stress, too much work, accumulated responsibilities, and so the emptiness keeps growing, fed by the lack of listening and space to be understood. When love does not comfort, it leaves emotional gaps. And these gaps do not remain empty for long. They fill with doubts, insecurities, and unanswered questions. You begin to wonder if you are asking for too much, if you are too sensitive, if the problem lies within you. This constant self-questioning erodes your self-esteem and deepens the sense of disconnection. Over time, emptiness begins to shape the way you relate to yourself. You lose the spark in small things. Laughter becomes more restrained. Spontaneity gives way to caution. You start living on autopilot, fulfilling tasks, maintaining the relationship, but without feeling truly present in any of it. It is like existing without being fully alive. What hurts the most is that this emptiness grows even when the other person does not notice anything wrong. To them, everything seems normal. The routine continues, commitments are kept, the right words are still spoken. But internally, you feel yourself drifting away from who you are. And this inner distance hurts more than any external conflict. This silent emptiness also brings guilt. Guilt for not feeling satisfied. Guilt for wanting something you cannot clearly explain. Guilt for thinking about leaving when, in theory, there is no concrete reason. And so, you stay, trying to justify a feeling that refuses to be rationalized. Ignoring this emptiness does not make it disappear. It only deepens. The body starts to send signals: constant tension, lack of energy, anxiety without an apparent cause. The mind becomes more scattered, the heart more closed. All of these are ways your inner world tries to draw attention to something that needs care. Recognizing that emptiness is growing is an act of courage. It does not mean making immediate decisions, but accepting that something is out of balance. Emptiness is not the enemy. It is a messenger. It points to unmet emotional needs, crossed boundaries, and parts of yourself that are being neglected. When you allow yourself to listen to this silence, you begin to create space to understand what is truly missing. And only from this honest listening can you decide whether this love can be rebuilt as a shelter, or whether it will continue to be a place where emptiness grows, even in the presence of another. There comes a delicate point in many relationships where the effort to maintain the bond stops being shared and becomes solitary. You begin to realize that, in order to avoid conflicts, distancing, or even deeper silences, you must constantly adjust yourself. Adjust your tone of voice. Adjust what you feel. Adjust what you expect. And without noticing, this constant adjustment slowly pulls you away from who you are. At first, it feels like maturity. You believe you are being understanding, flexible, patient. You tell yourself that every relationship requires compromise, and that loving also means giving in. But the problem is not giving in. The problem is always giving in. It is repeatedly giving up pieces of yourself until very little of you remains. When love does not comfort, you begin to emotionally monitor yourself. Before speaking, you think twice. Before showing how you feel, you hold back. Before asking for something, you give up. Not because you stopped feeling, but because you learned that feeling too much in that space can lead to rejection, distance, or frustration. And so, to keep the love, you start abandoning yourself. This self-abandonment is quiet and deeply exhausting. It does not happen all at once. It happens through small daily choices: not saying something important, accepting less than you need, minimizing pain so you don't seem too sensitive. Each small renunciation seems harmless, but together they build an enormous emptiness. Over time, you no longer know where love ends and fear of loss begins. Your decisions become guided more by the attempt to keep the other person than by the desire to be true to yourself. And this creates an unbalanced relationship, where one person adapts while the other remains comfortable. The body feels this abandonment before the mind fully understands it. Constant fatigue appears, along with the feeling of always being in emotional debt, as if you had to prove your worth all the time. You try to be enough, but you never truly feel chosen. This ongoing state of tension slowly drains your energy and self-esteem. What hurts the most is realizing that, while trying to preserve the relationship, you begin to disappear within it. Your preferences move to the background. Your needs seem excessive. Your feelings become an inconvenience. And little by little, you start to wonder if you are still yourself, or just a reduced version, shaped to fit. This kind of love demands a high price. It does not hurt through obvious aggression, but through the lack of space to exist fully. Love should not require you to silence yourself, shrink yourself, or disconnect from who you are. When that happens, love stops being a meeting and becomes emotional survival. Recognizing that you are abandoning yourself is painful, but liberating. It is the moment when you begin to see that maintaining love at the cost of yourself is not healthy love. It is continuous sacrifice, and no bond that requires your disappearance can truly be called care. Looking at this honestly does not mean making immediate decisions, but reclaiming the right to exist whole within a relationship. Because the love worth having does not ask you to lose yourself. It invites you to be, not to vanish. In many relationships where emptiness grows, a difficult but necessary question eventually arises. What is keeping me here? Love or attachment? This distinction is not simple, because love and attachment can coexist for a long time. The problem begins when attachment starts guiding decisions, while love can no longer sustain the bond on its own. Attachment is born from fear of loneliness, fear of starting over, fear of losing the shared history, fear of admitting that something is not working. Unlike love, which expands, attachment contracts. It holds. It keeps a person in place not because of the desire to stay, but because of the fear of leaving. And when attachment takes control, the relationship stops being a space of conscious choice and becomes a space of forced permanence. You notice this when you begin to justify suffering in the name of time invested. Years shared, plans made, promises exchanged. All of this weighs heavily on the decision to stay, even when the present no longer offers comfort. The idea of leaving feels more painful than continuing, even if continuing means enduring daily emptiness. When love still exists, it usually brings some form of genuine care, even amid difficulties. There is dialogue, interest, an attempt to repair. In attachment, what exists is maintenance. The routine is maintained, the bond is maintained, the appearance of normality is maintained. But deep connection is gradually set aside, as if it were a secondary detail. A clear sign that attachment is speaking louder is when you start negotiating your own limits. What was once unacceptable becomes tolerated, not because it stopped hurting, but because you believe you would not be able to handle the loss. And so, little by little, the pattern of suffering becomes normalized. Attachment also shows itself in the constant hope that the other person will change, even without concrete signs of transformation. You cling to the past version of the relationship, to what it once was, and not to what it is today. This hope, though understandable, often prevents you from facing the current reality. Distinguishing love from attachment requires emotional honesty. It requires observing whether you stay because you want to, or because you are afraid not to. It requires noticing whether the relationship still nourishes you or merely keeps you occupied, preventing you from facing your own emptiness and insecurities. Staying out of love is a daily choice that, even in difficult moments, preserves emotional dignity. Staying out of attachment is a silent prison, where you convince yourself that you have no alternative. And no healthy relationship should be sustained by fear. Recognizing attachment does not mean devaluing everything that was lived. It simply means accepting that what was important in the past may not be enough to sustain the present. And this acceptance, although painful, is essential to stop the growth of emptiness. When you begin to ask yourself whether you are still there out of love or merely out of attachment, something inside you is already asking for change. And listening to that question is a fundamental step toward reclaiming your emotional freedom. Even before you can organize in words what is happening emotionally, the body already begins to show clear signs that something is not right. The body is always the first to react when love stops being a place of comfort and becomes a space of tension. It perceives what the mind still tries to deny. You begin to feel tired frequently, even without an obvious physical reason. You sleep, but you do not rest. You wake up already feeling the weight of the day, as if you are always one step behind yourself. Small tasks require more effort than before. Energy decreases, and motivation slowly fades. Anxiety often appears subtly as well. Not as an intense attack, but as a constant state of uneasiness. A tightness in the chest, shallow breathing, a permanent sense of alert. It feels as though your emotional system is always expecting something to go wrong, even when nothing apparently happens. The body reacts to the emotional environment. When you live in a relationship where you must monitor yourself, adapt, and hold back, the organism enters defense mode. Muscles remain tense. The mind never fully relaxes. Rest becomes superficial. And over time, this translates into aches, discomfort, and a continuous sense of exhaustion. Another common sign is the loss of connection with pleasure. Activities that once brought joy begin to feel dull. Laughter becomes less spontaneous. Interest fades. Not because you stopped liking things, but because much of your energy is being consumed trying to maintain an emotional balance that no longer holds. Many people ignore these signals because they do not directly associate them with the relationship. They attribute fatigue to work, anxiety to responsibilities, sadness to routine. But the body does not separate areas of life. It responds to the whole. And when love does not welcome you, this impact silently spreads through every dimension of your daily life. What is most delicate is that, by ignoring these signs, you begin to disconnect even more from yourself. Instead of listening to your body, you force yourself to keep going. You demand more from yourself. You push yourself to endure. And this cycle of self-negation deepens emotional emptiness. Listening to the body is not exaggeration or weakness. It is a legitimate form of care. The body does not get sick by chance. It expresses what has not been said, what has not found space to be emotionally recognized. When you begin to pay attention to these signs, not to blame yourself, but to understand, something shifts. You start to see that emptiness is not just an abstract feeling, but an experience lived in the body, in your rhythm, in your breath. And this awareness is essential to interrupt the process of exhaustion. Understanding that the body feels before the mind understands is an invitation to listen, an invitation to respect your limits, your needs, and your internal signals. Because no love should cost you your emotional and physical health. When it does, something needs to be reviewed with honesty and care. There comes a moment when the pain of staying in a relationship begins to outweigh the fear of leaving. This moment does not happen suddenly. It is built gradually, as emptiness deepens, exhaustion increases, and hope for change slowly wears down. You are still there, but you no longer feel whole. You no longer feel at home. Staying begins to demand constant emotional effort. You wake up and mentally prepare yourself for another day of adaptation, silence, and self-restraint. The simple thought of the future creates anxiety, not because you do not love, but because you can no longer imagine living for much longer in this state of disconnection. The pain of leaving, on the other hand, is immediate and visible. It involves clear losses, the shared routine, the plans that were built, the identity of being a couple. It is a pain you can name. The pain of staying is diffuse, silent, and continuous. It seeps into daily life and slowly erodes your vitality without drawing attention. Many people remain in relationships that empty them because they believe the pain of leaving will be unbearable. But over time, they realize they are already enduring something equally painful, the gradual loss of themselves. And this loss is harder to recover than any broken routine. When staying hurts more than leaving, the body and mind enter into conflict. One part of you wants to preserve the bond, while another asks for rest. Guilt arises for considering leaving. Fear of judgment, regret, and loneliness appears. And yet, the feeling that something needs to change becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. This point is not about giving up easily. It is about recognizing limits. Love should not be an experience of emotional survival. When being together requires you to erase yourself, silence yourself, or harden yourself, the cost becomes too high. The most challenging part is accepting that sometimes love does not end because feelings are gone, but because there is no longer space to exist truthfully. You can love someone and still recognize that the relationship does not allow you to be who you are today. And this awareness does not diminish what was lived. It simply honors who you have become. Leaving, in these cases, is not an act of coldness, but of clarity. It is a movement of emotional protection. It does not mean the pain disappears, but that it stops being permanent. The pain of leaving tends to lessen with time. The pain of staying in endless emptiness does not. Recognizing that staying is hurting more than leaving is one of the clearest signs that you need to choose yourself. Not to hurt the other, but to stop hurting yourself. Choosing yourself, in this context, is an act of emotional responsibility. This recognition does not demand immediate decisions, but it does ask for honesty with yourself. because ignoring this inner call is prolonging a suffering that no longer needs to continue in the same way. Even when you begin to realize that staying in a relationship is draining you, a powerful feeling arises that tries to keep you in the same place. Guilt. Guilt for thinking about yourself. Guilt for considering leaving. Guilt for imagining a life different from the one built together. This guilt does not come from nowhere. It is fueled by the idea that choosing yourself is a selfish act. You start worrying more about the pain your decision might cause the other person than about the pain you already feel every day. You place the other's well-being above your own, even when that means continuing to erase yourself. And so, guilt becomes an emotional prison that prevents any movement toward change. The fear of disappointing others also weighs heavily. Disappointing the person you are with, family, friends, and the expectations created over time. You feel that leaving would be admitting failure, as if the relationship were a test you did not pass. This feeling makes you take responsibility for something that, in truth, never depended solely on you. When love does not comfort, but you stay out of guilt, the suffering becomes even deeper. Because beyond the emptiness, there is the feeling of betraying yourself. You know something is wrong, yet you force yourself to continue to avoid causing pain or disappointment. And this inner contradiction generates enormous emotional exhaustion. Guilt also distorts the perception of what care really is. You begin to confuse love with constant sacrifice. You believe that loving means enduring, tolerating, giving up. But healthy love does not require martyrdom. It requires presence, respect, and space for both people to exist with emotional dignity. Choosing yourself does not mean ignoring the other. It means recognizing that you matter too, that your feelings have value, that your emotional health is not negotiable. When you choose yourself, you are not attacking anyone. You are simply protecting yourself. The fear of disappointing often comes from the difficulty of accepting that not all stories have an idealized ending. Some stories fulfill their purpose for a time, and then ask for transformation or closure, and that does not invalidate what was lived. It simply acknowledges that people change, mature, and have different needs throughout life. Freeing yourself from guilt is not simple. It requires a more compassionate look at yourself. It requires understanding that staying in a relationship that makes you ill is not an act of love, neither for you nor for the other. It is merely the continuation of a suffering that could be transformed. When you begin to allow yourself to think about yourself without judgment, something opens up. A space of clarity. A space where decisions stop being driven by fear and start being guided by inner truth. And this truth, as difficult as it may be, is always lighter than living in denial. Guilt lessens when you understand that choosing yourself is not abandoning the other, but stopping the abandonment of yourself. And this understanding is an essential step toward breaking the cycle of emptiness and reclaiming self-respect. Even before any concrete decision is made, there is an internal process that few people recognize. Silent grief. It is the grief for the love you imagined, for the bond you believed would become a place of shelter, but that over time failed to sustain that promise. This grief does not happen after the ending. It happens while the relationship still exists. You begin to realize that you are not only suffering because of the present, but also because of the future that never materialized. The plans that lost their meaning. The expectations that had to be revised. And this pain is complex, because there is no clear event that authorizes this suffering. The relationship continues, but something essential has already been lost. This grief is silent, because it is rarely shared. You feel you do not have the right to grieve. After all, nothing serious happened. There was no official breakup, no definitive event, and yet, there is a deep sense of loss. Loss of hope, of illusion, of emotional belonging. During this process, you may notice a subtle shift in your perception. Things that once seemed promising now feel empty. Words that once brought comfort now echo without depth. You begin to see the relationship with more clarity, but this clarity hurts because it dismantles the narratives that helped you stay for so long. Grieving the love that was not also involves accepting limits. Accepting that the other person may not be able to offer what you need. Accepting that, no matter how much effort exists, some connections do not evolve into what we imagined. And this acceptance is one of the hardest parts, because it directly confronts the desire for things to be different. Many people try to rush this grief or ignore it, focusing only on practical decisions, stay or leave. But grief does not respect shortcuts. It needs to be felt so that any future choice is not made from denial or escape, but from awareness. This process can also generate ambivalence. On some days, you feel strength and clarity. On others, doubt and longing. You oscillate between accepting reality and wanting to believe again. This oscillation is not weakness. It is a natural part of internally saying goodbye to something that mattered. Allowing yourself to live this grief is an act of self-respect. It is acknowledging that you invested feelings, time, and energy into something that had value. And feeling pain does not mean failure, but genuine involvement. When grief begins to be processed, something shifts. The pain becomes less confusing and more defined. Sad? Yes, but honest. And this emotional honesty opens space for decisions that are more aligned with who you have become, rather than who you needed to be to maintain that relationship. Silent grief is the closing of an internal cycle, even if the external cycle has not yet ended. And moving through it consciously is essential, so that emptiness does not continue to grow, but can slowly give way to a new kind of presence. Your own. There comes a moment when, after moving through emptiness, guilt, grief, and fear, something begins to reorganize internally. Not abruptly, and not with ready-made answers, but with a subtle sense of return. A return to yourself. You realize that regardless of what happens to the relationship, there is something that can no longer be ignored: the need to respect yourself. At this point, love stops being just a story lived with another person and becomes a profound lesson about who you are, what you need, and what you are no longer willing to accept. The suffering that once felt meaningless begins to gain meaning, not because the pain was small, but because it taught you boundaries. Returning to yourself does not mean becoming hardened, closing your heart, or losing faith in love. It means loving with more awareness. It means understanding that love is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of care. Not perfection, but emotional safety. And above all, not a place where you have to lose yourself in order to stay. When you choose yourself, something changes in the way you relate to the world. You begin to notice signs more clearly, to respect discomfort before it turns into deep emptiness, to listen to your body, emotions, and silences with greater attention. This does not make you less loving, it makes you more whole. This return to yourself also brings responsibility. The responsibility not to repeat patterns that hurt you, not to confuse intensity with depth, not to accept emotional crumbs in the name of unfinished stories. It is a commitment to yourself, built from lived experience. The love that did not comfort leaves marks, but it also leaves awareness. It shows where you abandoned yourself, where you stayed silent too long, where you remained out of fear. And this clarity is valuable, because it prevents you from losing yourself in the same way again. Over time, the emptiness that once seemed to fill everything begins to give way to another kind of space. A more honest space, more aligned with who you are. It is not euphoria, it is presence. Not absolute certainty, but enough peace to move forward. Closing a cycle, internally or externally, does not mean denying the love that existed. It means recognizing that it fulfilled its purpose. Some stories teach us how to love others. Others finally teach us how to love ourselves. When love becomes learning, it no longer hurts in the same way. It transforms into reference, into boundary, into care. And you move forward not empty, but aware. not wounded, but more truthful with yourself. Returning to yourself is the end of one kind of pain and the beginning of a more honest relationship with life itself. And this may be the most important love you can build.